Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're doing something a little different. We are stepping way back in time, 2,000 years back to be exact, into a narrative that has completely shaped history, art, and the human soul. We're looking at an account titled The Supper, Last Love. And to truly grasp the immense weight of this story, we can't just skim through it. We need to actively slow our pace right down and immerse ourselves in the environment. I want you to imagine the setting, not from a safe academic distance, but as if you're standing right inside that tense, flickering, candlelit upper room. Feel the oppressive heat of the Middle Eastern evening. Think about the heavy, thick dust clinging to their sandals after miles of walking the ancient, unpaved roads of Jerusalem. Imagine the deep, physical exhaustion just settling into the bones of these men. As the shadows stretch long against the stone walls, the ultimate confrontation is about to begin. It's a collision between light and darkness, between an unfathomable love and our very deep, very real human frailty. This is a profound exploration of how divine grace violently and beautifully infiltrates the absolute darkest of human moments. Let's dive in. The sources we're analyzing paint an incredibly rich sensory picture of this final gathering. This isn't a sterile painting, it's a breathing room. The air is thick with the savory scent of roasted Passover lamb, pungent bitter herbs, and unleavened bread. The men are arranged around a triclinium. That's a traditional, low, U-shaped ancient table. They aren't sitting in chairs like we do. They're reclining on cushions, leaning on their left elbows, which naturally puts them in incredibly close, intimate physical proximity to one another. But underneath all this sacred ritual, there is a heavy, almost suffocating tension in the room. The narrative reveals a completely cruel irony. In the sacred final hour, the disciples are actually arguing. They are literally elbowing each other, politically maneuvering, and whispering about who gets the seats of highest honor next to the host. They are calculating their future status in what they think will be a new earthly kingdom. They are completely oblivious to the massive violent storm that is about to break over the city. The shadow of a Roman cross and a heartbreaking betrayal are looming right over the table, and yet they're bickering about greatness. It's a profound, almost absurd collision of human vanity against the backdrop of an impending divine sacrifice. And then, the narrative portrays a moment where the entire room just falls dead silent. You can almost hear the scraping of wood against the stone floor. The petty bickering abruptly stops because the protagonist, Jesus, stands up from the meal. The ancient text delivers this sequence of actions with an agonizing, cinematic slowness. He deliberately takes off his outer garment. He picks up a coarse, rough linen towel and ties it around his waist. Then comes the sudden, startling slosh of water being poured into a copper basin. He physically kneels down on the hard stone floor and begins to wash the disciples' calloused, dirt-caked, road-weary feet, gently wiping them dry with the towel. Now, we have to understand the cultural details here. In the strict hierarchy of the ancient Middle East, this specific, dirty task was exclusively reserved for the lowest, most menial household slave. It wasn't just a nice gesture. It was incredibly degrading. It's a shocking, breathtaking visual sequence deliberately meant to completely shatter every single worldly definition of hierarchy and power. In completely redefining what power looks like, the text notes a deeply analytical, absolutely crucial detail. According to the sources, Jesus did not take on this menial task because he forgot who he was. He wasn't acting out of submission to the Roman state, and this wasn't a fleeting moment of weakness. The narrative explicitly states that he entered this moment fully knowing that all things had been put under his power. It presents the staggering paradox of ultimate sovereignty and servant leadership. Think about that. It was precisely in his moment of supreme, sovereign awareness that he chose the water basin and the coarse towel over a throne. He deliberately chose to redefine a king's power through absolute, ground-level humility and servanthood. True order and authority weren't being established by a lightning bolt or a loud royal decree. They were being established by the deliberate, quiet, incredibly intimate act of washing away road dirt. As you might expect, this causes a major scene. The sources highlight a visceral, explosive reaction from the disciple Peter. Picture him physically recoiling, his absolute indignation flaring up as his master approaches him with the basin. To his first-century sensibilities, seeing a highly respected rabbi stooping to the literal dirt of his feet was deeply horrifying. He protests fiercely, "You shall never wash my feet." The narrative then uses Peter's resistance to break down a profound theological distinction. The text introduces two very distinct concepts: the bath and the foot washing. The bath represents a once-for-all, foundational cleansing of a soul, a total spiritual reset. You're completely clean. However, the foot washing represents the daily, gritty necessity of ongoing sanctification. Because, let's face it, as humanity walks through the harsh, dusty roads of reality, we inevitably pick up the dirt of the world. The narrative boldly asserts that to reject this daily, humbling grace from him is to sever that intimate fellowship entirely. What's fascinating is how the text turns the psychological tension right back onto us, the readers. It offers this piercing insight into human nature. It suggests that, very often, our fierce human refusal to accept grace isn't rooted in humility at all. We aren't saying, "Oh, I'm too unworthy." Rather, our refusal functions as a rigid, prideful defense mechanism. The narrative directly challenges our deep desire to constantly appear as strong, highly competent warriors who can endlessly earn our own keep and fix our own problems. It highlights just how profoundly difficult it is to actually admit that we are spiritually exhausted, incredibly dusty, and so broken that we desperately require someone else to stoop down and wash away our dirt. The underlying, soul-searching question of the text asks us, when you are trapped in the darkest nights of your life, will you let your ingrained defense mechanisms prevent you from accepting this kind of humiliating, restorative grace? From there, the story takes a devastating, highly intimate turn. The text describes the washing of feet continuing right around the table, reaching even Judas Iscariot. To understand the sheer gravity of what happens next, we have to look at the details of that ancient seating arrangement. For Jesus, as the host, to later offer Judas a dipped piece of bread, known as the sop, they had to be reclining right next to each other on those cushions. In that ancient culture, offering the sop to a guest was the absolute highest mark of honor. It was a gesture of deep, trusted friendship. It is portrayed here as a final, tender, desperate reach across the table to a hardened heart, fully aware of the betrayal that was already in motion. Jesus knows exactly what Judas is about to do, yet he offers him the honor anyway. When Judas takes the bread, refuses the underlying grace, and walks out the door, the text delivers one of the most chilling, succinct lines in all of literature. And it was night. The literal, physical darkness outside perfectly mirrors a permanent, tragic, spiritual wilderness. The sources present a really deep psychological contrast between the two massive, catastrophic failures that occur that evening, the failure of Judas and the upcoming failure of Peter. Both men fall completely apart, but their trajectories are entirely different. Judas's trajectory is described as premeditated malice. He was deeply disillusioned that his master wasn't the political, military conqueror he had expected to overthrow Rome. Judas allowed that disappointment and greed to fester into a cold, highly calculated betrayal for profit. Peter's profile, on the other hand, is rooted in sincere weakness. He fiercely, genuinely loves his leader. He boasts this fiery, well-intentioned, but entirely misguided bravado. Peter relies solely on his own fleshly courage, completely unaware of his deep internal frailty. Judas's heart was malicious. Peter's heart was sincere, but he was completely unequipped to handle the crushing, terrifying pressure of the impending Roman authorities. So, when the text predicts Peter's impending, heartbreaking denial, it frames it in a very specific way. It's not framed as a curse or permanent rejection, but as what the sources call a divine crucible of the heart. You see, grace in this specific narrative isn't just portrayed as a soft, comforting, fluffy blanket. Sometimes it acts as a violent, absolute necessity, a dismantling of human ego. The crucible is carefully designed to expose and burn away Peter's intense vanity and his aggressive self-reliance. The narrative asserts that this predicted failure is actually an orchestrated intrusion of grace. Peter's arrogant, fleshly courage absolutely had to be completely broken down and leveled. Why? So that he could finally learn that true, lasting endurance isn't about conjuring up human willpower. It's about resting entirely on a sustaining force outside of himself. With Judas now gone into the night, just the 11 disciples remain. The air in the room is described as suddenly clear, yet incredibly heavy with this sense of impending departure. The narrative now shifts from physical confrontation to intimate, profound revelation, introducing what is termed a new commandment. Now, the basic instruction to love your neighbor was not new at all. That already existed deeply within the ancient Mosaic law. What the text claims is truly revolutionary here is the standard of that love. The benchmark shifts entirely. The standard is no longer just love your neighbor as much as you happen to love yourself. The new standard is strictly defined by the sacrificial, foot-washing, life-laying down action they had literally just witnessed. The physical act with the basin and the towel was, in essence, a visual, live-action rehearsal for this ultimate expectation. The narrative positions this radical, self-sacrificing love as the ultimate identifying mark, a true badge of discipleship. To fully grasp the weight of this, we really have to view it through the lens of the harsh, highly stratified reality of the first-century Roman Empire. That was a brutal society built entirely on dominance, military power, and very strict, unforgiving social hierarchies. In that kind of world, imagine a community marked not by outward religious rituals, not by specific holy garments, and not by high-minded philosophical debates, but by an unfathomable willingness to voluntarily take the posture of a slave for one another. It would be absolutely stunning. It was intended to be undeniable, living, breathing proof of an entirely different kind of kingdom, presented to a deeply cynical, fiercely observing world. At this point in the text, you can practically feel profound panic setting in among the disciples. Consider their psychological state for a moment. For 3 whole years, they have abandoned absolutely everything. They left their fishing nets, their lucrative tax booths, their extended families, their entire livelihoods and reputations. They have banked their entire existence on this one man sitting in front of them. And now, he is calmly speaking of betrayal, of imminent violent death, and of leaving them behind. The text captures this sense of absolute vertigo as these men stare over the edge into an abyss of separation. Yet, right over the edge of this terrifying precipice, the narrative introduces a sovereign imperative command. Do not let your hearts be troubled. He is instructing them to anchor their trust just as firmly in him as they do in the divine. To really anchor this staggering command, the text uses a powerful, culturally resonant metaphor. The original Greek word used here is monoke, which signifies a permanent, abiding dwelling place. But the true depth comes from the ancient Middle Eastern concept of a father's house. You see, in that culture, when a son got married, he didn't pack up and move away to the suburbs. The family simply built a new architectural addition onto the father's existing house. The family compound was continually expanding, continually growing, always making room for more life. The narrative is deeply assuring these terrified men that the ultimate destination of the universe is precisely like this infinitely expanding estate. It describes a place of permanent warmth, ultimate belonging, and profound safety, where absolutely no one is ever left out in the cold. The text leans into the beautiful, relatable analogy of expectant parents lovingly and meticulously preparing a nursery for a new baby. But the sources unpack this as a complex, dual preparation process. First, the narrative argues that the literal, physical path to this eternal dwelling is actively being forged right then and there through the impending, violent sacrifice of the cross. That act is the ultimate opening of the heavy door. But simultaneously, a profound internal preparation is happening within the individuals themselves. The argument is that all the earthly trials, the deep suffering, and the metaphorical foot-washing they must endure are literally constructing and expanding the human soul's capacity. It's building the spiritual muscles necessary to eventually handle the immense, overwhelming weight and glory of that prepared eternal space. Naturally, the disciple Thomas voices the raw, honest confusion of the entire room. He essentially asks for literal turn-by-turn directions. We don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? The response provided in the text is singular when you compare it to other ancient literature. Most ancient philosophies, Stoic traditions, or religious systems pointed to a strict set of rules, a detailed philosophical map, or an eightfold path to somehow achieve enlightenment. But the narrative here offers a strictly relational, completely personified answer. I am the way and the truth and the life. The text makes this immense, staggering claim that he doesn't merely point out a path to follow. He personally embodies it. Because he physically walks the horrific path of the cross, he actually is the way. The person himself is the exact geography of the path home. This leads right into a profound divine assurance designed to counter their deepest, darkest fear. We have to look at the rabbinical tradition of that specific era. The bond between a master and his disciples was intensely tight. It almost surpassed biological family ties. If a master died, his followers were considered literal cultural orphans. It was a devastating social and spiritual death sentence. Understanding that historical context gives immense emotional resonance to the promise he makes. I will come back and take you to be with me. Notice how the text subtly redefines the very concept of heaven here. Heaven is not described primarily as a distant place of golden streets, harps, or pearly gates. It is defined simply as the permanent, eternal closing of the spatial distance between the master and his deeply loved students. The narrative then transitions to what these men are actually supposed to do in the interim while he's gone. And it offers a claim that must have sounded utterly, laughably absurd to a group of uneducated laborers huddled in a small, tense room. They are promised they will do greater works. Now, the sources are very careful to clarify this. This means greater in scope, not greater in nature. No one was going to outperform the literal physical miracles they'd already witnessed. Geographically, however, this movement, which is starting right now with a handful of dusty fishermen in a backwater-occupied province of the Roman Empire, is commanded to reach the absolute centers of the known world, from the bustling, powerful streets of Rome all the way to the distant shores of India. It represents a massive, truly miraculous promotion. But the obvious question immediately arises: how on earth could 11 isolated, terrified men accomplish a global scope without their master physically present to guide them? The text introduces the concept of the paraclete, an advocate, a counselor, or a strengthener. The linguistic detail here is absolutely vital. The original language uses a highly specific word meaning another of the exact same kind. The narrative is abundantly clear that this isn't just a dispatched angel, a stand-in human representative, or a new prophet. The text claims this presence possesses the exact same essence, the same nature, and the same character as Jesus, specifically designed to serve as a perfect, intimate bridge across the vast, terrifying divide between heaven and the isolated human heart. The sources weave the roles of this paraclete into a comprehensive, deeply personal support system. I want you to imagine one of these very disciples, maybe decades later, facing execution or rotting away in a dark, damp Roman dungeon. The text promises that this indwelling presence, dwelling internally, inside them, not just hovering nearby in the room, would actively remind them of these eternal truths when the cold stone walls tried to make them forget. It claims this presence would take the impossibly high standard of that new commandment, to love unconditionally and sacrificially, and actively transform it from a rigid external rule into a living, breathing power inside them. It effectively proves that physical distance from Christ actually, miraculously, resulted in much deeper spiritual intimacy. As the narrative prepares to finally leave the upper room and head out toward the garden, it outlines a final will and testament, bequeathing one specific thing: peace. The sources draw a really sharp, fascinating contrast here. Outside the walls of that upper room lay the famous Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But this was a fragile, forced order. It was maintained by the brutal, crushing weight of military force and the constant, terrifying threat of crucifixion. It relied entirely on managing outward circumstances. The text completely contrasts this external, circumstance-dependent peace with an internal, defiant tranquility. It describes an enduring anchor in the storm that remains completely unshaken, even as the protagonist knowingly gets up and walks directly toward his own brutal execution. Looking back over the entire narrative of this single extraordinary evening, the sources trace an incredible physical and emotional arc. Think about where we started. From the rough, coarse texture of the servant's towel and the intensely awkward silence of washing dusty feet, to the agonizing intimacy of offering bread to a known betrayer. From the violent, entirely necessary dismantling of a loyal friend's ego, all the way up to the soaring theological heights of eternal, infinitely expanding dwellings. The text frames this entire chaotic sequence not as a tragedy slowly falling apart, but as a meticulously orchestrated intrusion of grace. It is presented to us as a masterpiece of redemption, woven directly and deliberately through the absolute darkest, messiest elements of human reality. The source material ultimately leaves its audience with a provocative, deeply personal thematic challenge. When you are facing your own proverbial night, whether you're feeling betrayed, whether you feel completely unequipped for the crushing pressure of life like Peter, or if you just feel trapped by insurmountable circumstances, the narrative asks a lingering question. Do we only see the iron bars of the immediate darkness around us, or can we somehow perceive the careful, loving orchestration of a much deeper, enduring grace at work behind the scenes? The text boldly suggests that the darkness is never ever the end of the story. Rather, it is simply the stark, necessary canvas required to display this unfathomable love. It invites you to look past the night, to surrender your pride, and to recognize the eternal, welcoming home prepared just beyond the shadows. Some to think about.